Good. Good evening, everyone. I'm RCDSO President Harinder Sandhu. I want to welcome you to this evening's RCDSO Connect session. Thank you for joining us. Tonight's webinar will look to address common communication challenges in dentistry. This includes the importance of consent to treatment, active listening, and respectful dialogue. Gillian Slaughter, the College Director of Professional Conduct and Regulatory Affairs, will moderate tonight's session. She will be joined by two lawyers, Ahmad Mozaffari and John McIntyre. Both of them are well-versed in health regulation and professional regulation and health law. Our discussion will be focused on the importance of upholding professional and ethical standards in patient interactions. And at this point, Jill, over to you.
Thank you, Harinder. Before we start our discussion, I'd like to recognize the privilege of gathering online this evening by sharing a land acknowledgement. The RCDSO is on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. These traditional lands are known to some as Toronto. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples from across Turtle Island. This land is also part of the Dish with One Spoon territory, a treaty between allied nations to peaceably share and care for this land. We accept our responsibility to each other and this land that we live and work on in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We are committed to actively supporting the necessary work towards truth, reconciliation, and equity. We embrace our role in regulating dentists, in protecting the public interest, and strengthening our partnerships with Indigenous communities to advance access to safe and equitable oral health care. Thank you. I am so pleased to be joining you today. I'd like to introduce the speakers who will be leading our webinar tonight. Ahmad Mozaffari is counsel at the law firm Steineke McIntyre LeBlanc, where he practices in all areas of professional regulation. Ahmad has appeared before all levels of court in Ontario, as well as specialized administrative tribunals. Ahmad's practice also includes representing regulators on appeals before the divisional court. Prior to joining Steineke McIntyre LeBlanc, Ahmad gained varied litigation experience at a boutique litigation firm where he practiced primarily in the area of professional regulation, representing professionals in civil and regulatory proceedings, as well as prosecuting on behalf of several health regulators. Most recently, Ahmad worked at a large financial institution where he maintained a broad practice including fraud, anti-money laundering, and class actions litigation. We're also fortunate to be joined by John McIntyre, who is a lawyer and co-founder at McIntyre Szabo PC, a boutique health law firm in Toronto. John routinely represents healthcare institutions and regulated health providers, with a large part of his practice supporting dentists. John also spends a large part of his practice on pro bono work at the intersection of 2S LGBTQ+ rights in healthcare. He has his Master's of Public Health from Johns Hopkins University and has worked for the last 2 years as an adjunct professor at Queen's University Faculty of Law. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
And with that, let me ask the first question to Ahmad. The college receives hundreds of complaints about communication every year. Communication is consistently one of the top 3 reasons why people complain to the college. About 30% of all investigations raise communication as an issue. So my question is, in your experience representing regulators and health professionals, what are some of the most common communication failures that lead to regulatory complaints or investigations? And what are some of the common assumptions that dentists make that lead to communication issues?
Thanks very much, Jill, and good evening, everyone. So I did want to just preface my comments this evening by saying that a lot of what we're going to be talking about deals with matters that will necessarily be case specific, and a lot of things turn on their facts. So that's always important to bear in mind. And of course, our comments tonight aren't intended to be legal advice. But returning to the question, we do often see complaints and investigations arising as a result of communication challenges or failures, as you put it. And an example of a communication challenge is, for instance, when a patient, this may sound basic, but just simply doesn't understand what a dentist is trying to communicate to them. This could be the result of perhaps not using accessible language, which can lead to a misunderstanding. Or a patient may even misinterpret what a dentist is trying to say. There may have never been an intent to offend or to negatively impact the patient, but that's sort of what's occurred. And this is where the assumption comes in, which is the second part of the issue. And a related assumption here would be that the patient understands what's, the information that's being conveyed to them. We're very fortunate to be involved in practice areas. I've always found this about being a lawyer, where you end up interacting with people from different backgrounds. And I'd say it's the same thing for dentists as well. But given this diversity in your patient population, it's important for dentists to ensure that you are communicating in sort of a clear and accessible way, and to confirm that the patient understands what's being said to them. Now, we often also get communication issues arising in terms of how a particular patient, not how a dentist is communication, not what they're communicating, but how they are communicating. For instance, someone's tone, for instance. Sometimes there's a tendency to convey information in a perhaps more scientific or analytical way. And that may not be well received by a patient. And again, this goes back to the idea of being accessible and trying to use language that patients will understand. And sometimes when using sort of analytical language or more scientific language, it may be packaging the information in a way that's firstly difficult to understand, but also may come off as being unsympathetic, especially if you're dealing with something that's a specific, an important issue to a patient. So in addition to the tone, also consider your body language. Some people just happen to be close talkers. Some people may, while communicating, say, place a hand on a shoulder. That may just be the way that they communicate. But not everyone will interpret that in the same way. Some patients may view that as sort of a boundary issue, and we'll be talking more about those later on. I've also found another common area where that's fraught with risk is humor. You have to be very careful with jokes. They're obviously not related to the treatment you're providing, and often they don't land with patients. And something that a dentist may find humorous isn't necessarily something that a patient or would resonate with a patient. May lead them, leave them feeling uncomfortable, particularly if you're talking about, say, political jokes or something that could be, interpreted as culturally inappropriate. So I would approach humor with a bit of caution. And politics, for instance, nowadays is a particularly thorny issue. So we want to sort of avoid that. And the last area that I wanted to touch on is there are often communication issues in the context of social media posts. Often the assumption from dentists is that what I say or what I post about in my private life is sort of off limits. That's my life. It's my Instagram or it's my other social media platform. But that's not always the case. Personal social media posts can become the subject of regulatory scrutiny, especially where a dentist is posting from an account that identifies them as a dentist, or where the leap wouldn't be too difficult to make. There was a recent case in the courts involving a dentist posting on social media, and the posts were intended, I think, to be humorous, but they also involved references to sexual activity, which ultimately led to a report to the college. And the dentist was ordered to complete a SCRP. And in upholding that decision, the court noted that the dentist had posted using an account that identified them as a dentist, and had appeared in one of the posts wearing scrubs, and apparently from a dental office. And there were also references to treatment. So this shows us that these kinds of communications are not off limits from regulatory scrutiny, even when there's no patient involved, when there's no patient in the mix, and when the communication isn't directed at a particular person or patient. So I would really, I guess my comment would be to use your best judgment. It's a balance. You're also people with private lives, and you may wish to post about things, and you're entitled to your own personal views, of course. The courts have been clear that regulated professionals are entitled to comment on important issues, and they do enjoy the freedom of expression that we all enjoy. But always be careful that your posts are appropriate, that they're not offensive, and they wouldn't be viewed as offensive or discriminatory. And a recommendation I'd leave you with is to really review the use of social media guidelines that are published by the college. And the website also lists some examples of inappropriate online behaviors, which dentists should review and may find helpful.
Ahmad, thanks so much. That's a really helpful overview of a number of issues and some tips along the way. John, can you share your perspective on this too?
Yeah, and thanks for having me. I think just to explain where I'm coming from is I spend a lot of my practice representing dentists on complaints to the college. And like Jill said, a large portion of those do include communication issues. And so a lot of what we're going to be speaking about tonight, I think may seem obvious to you as we say it, but given the volume of complaints that we see, I really think it's worth listening and taking this to heart because it's not actually as obvious as you're going to feel listening to us speaking tonight. Now, in direct patient care, I routinely see three main categories of communications-based complaints, and they all come down to a mismatch in expectations between the dentist and the patient. So the first category that I see a lot of is where a patient is saying that the dentist was cold or rude or uncaring. And certainly sometimes that's legitimate and that's how the dentist did come across and intended to come across in that. But I find for the most part, that's not intentional. That's just a kind of mismatch in how the dentist thinks they're coming across and how the patient is interpreting it. And I think one of the things I would encourage you to think about in these kind of scenarios is for a patient coming in, you're probably the only dentist that they're seeing. They probably only come in every now and then. They probably have anxiety around coming in. Whereas for you, you're seeing tons of patients each day. And so what might seem obvious or easy for you to understand and grasp might be very challenging for them too. So always trying to put yourself into their position and consider what they might view about what you're saying and how it might be a little bit different. And in that category, we often see in those complaints where patients are saying that they felt rushed or not listened to. And so that's something for you to consider in how you're coming across to your patient because they want to make sure that they are able to give their informed consent because they are getting all of their questions answered and able to talk through it with you. Now, the second category I see a lot of around billing issues, and that really comes into kind of the expectations for what the cost of treatment is going to be. And this is very different for dentists compared to some other healthcare providers. For most physicians and nurses, they don't have to deal with billing in the way that you do. But for you, dental costs can be quite high for a family with an average income, and it's something that's very concerning to most patients that are coming through your door. And we'll talk a little bit more later about how the fee that you're charging is a part of the informed consent discussion. But when we're talking about expectations around costs, the other complicating factor that you have as dentists is the whole idea of insurance. Some of your offices are assignment-based, some are not. Patients don't fully realize that they're actually responsible for understanding their own insurance plan, and it's not necessarily your role as a dentist. So that often results in mismatched expectations that can often result in complaints down the road. And then the third category that we're going to spend a little bit more time later on talking about is informed consent discussions. So did that complication materialize that you did or didn't discuss at the start of treatment? And did they really understand what that meant? We often see complaints where a patient says after the fact, well, I had no idea that could have even happened. And if I knew that, I never would have gone through treatment. And so the other thing to think about in those is oftentimes patients aren't articulating the informed consent issue in their complaint perfectly, but the college, when they have a complaint, they're always looking at your informed consent practices, your record-keeping practices. So no matter what the complaint to the college is about, it might bring in your informed consent practices and whether you've done an adequate job in explaining things. So that's a really important area for you to always make sure that you are on top of. Now, Ahmad already mentioned a little bit about how outside of direct patient care, there can be communication issues that lead to complaints. And a couple of those that can come up is I see a lot of complaints coming from the way an office staff member treated a patient. And even though that's not your direct responsibility, there often is an indirect responsibility for that, especially if you're the owner of a clinic or if you're involved in kind of how that staff member is approaching different patients or in supervising that staff member. So it's important to consider that there are other ways outside of your just direct communication with patients that might engage a complaint on communication. And beyond the social, or I mean, I guess another example of the social media issues that I see most frequently is kind of public commentary online too. So not just having a TikTok account where you're trying to be funny or things like that, but if you're, for example, during the COVID pandemic, many physicians, dentists, nurses were posting misinformation about COVID, and that's something a lot of the colleges became involved in regulating. Or an area that I'm heavily involved in is when healthcare providers make significant discriminatory anti-trans comments online, and how that creates a barrier for trans people to feel comfortable going to see a dentist or a nurse or a physician. And so it is something that the colleges will feel that they should intervene on. Google reviews. A lot of you don't necessarily think if you respond to a Google review, what you say in that might actually be something that the college looks at later on, but that is directly connected to your practice. And so you should always be conscious of how you're communicating in that way. And I think to add to what Ahmad was saying about the assumptions and that second part of the question, I think that the biggest assumption I see dentists making is that just because they've explained something, the patient has processed and understood it. And that's often not the case. And so that's where when we talk later on in today's chat about active listening and making sure that we're really making sure that that patient understands what you're talking about becomes most important. Now, just quickly before I pass back to Jill, I just wanted to say that I will be going on and off camera a little bit tonight. I have an unfortunate flare-up of my back injury tonight, so I'm going to go between sitting and standing, but I'm still here and looking forward to participating with you all tonight.
Thanks so much, John. You both have given a really great overview of a number of issues there. And so I'm going to put this back over about not a particular case, but maybe we can talk about some examples where miscommunication was a main factor behind a complaint to the college. And perhaps you could speak to what could have been done differently to prevent it. And so, John, if you wouldn't mind taking that first spot to speak to it, that'd be great.
Yeah, and there are many possible cases to choose from here, so I spent a lot of time thinking about which ones I would go through, and I've ultimately picked two that I'm going to talk about that aren't actually just one case. They're a conglomerate of multiple cases because the issue has come up kind of in multiple ways a little bit differently. So for the first example, this is where a patient came in with an orthodontic wire that was somewhat sticking out. And there was a miscommunication between the patient and the front desk staff member, then the dental assistant, and then the dentist about what he actually wanted done. And so the patient expressed in his complaint that what he just wanted was for the wire to be fixed, and he thought that that was quite obvious. But the staff and the dentist actually understood that he wanted it entirely removed and felt that they had had clear discussions with him about the risks of removing it and why he probably didn't want to, but felt he gave clear instructions that he wanted it entirely removed. And so once the wire was ultimately removed and the patient realized that that was what happened, he became quite angry and left and made an ultimate complaint to the college. And I think looking back, these kind of complaints are always challenging to me because they're the result of a miscommunication where everybody does feel like they're being entirely clear. So I think when the college talked to the patient and when I spoke to my clients on these kind of complaints, they all felt, well, what else could I have done? I thought that it was entirely obvious. But I think one of the things that this complaint highlighted to me is the idea of confirmation bias. So in this case, the staff member at the front desk thought it was something and passed it along to the assistant. So when the assistant talked to the patient, she went in thinking, oh, this is exactly what he wants. And when he answered a couple things, she felt that that made it clear, but maybe didn't have a fulsome discussion because she already felt she understood what was needed. And then it ended up with the dentist where kind of the same thing might have happened to a certain degree. And so it's always important that as much as you might have other forms of information coming in, have that full conversation with your client in that instance to make sure that it's actually making sense and it's all lining up. I would also say for something atypical, and as I understand, kind of removing a retainer wire that somebody's had for a while probably isn't what most people are seeking, get it in writing or make sure that it's just so clear and you document it so well with that patient. Because when things are when you get that red flag going off in your head of like, okay, well, why would they be asking for this? Does this make sense? Just go that extra step to make sure that you've communicated clearly and you both understand each other, because even if you think that you understand each other, you might not. Now, in this case, the college didn't ultimately take any action against the dentist because it was so clear it was a miscommunication and there was no kind of intentional act or any harm that came from it. But it's still then a process for you to go through that could be avoided if you perhaps took those steps to begin with. Now, a second one that comes up quite routinely is not so much about a miscommunication, but about providing fulsome disclosure to a patient. So it's not uncommon, as many of you know, in a root canal treatment for a file to break off and to be stuck in the tooth. That's a known complication. The college does not see you as being below the standard of care just because a file broke off in the tooth. But what often comes up in these cases is that communication aspect from once that happens. And so in the example that I've kind of created tonight, it's where the dentist shared with the patient that, okay, I wasn't able to complete your root canal, you should really go see a specialist, but doesn't disclose that they've seen that there is a broken file in the patient's tooth. Then that patient goes to a specialist and the specialist identifies that there's a broken file in that tooth. Well, now the patient, even though that's kind of a typical complication that can occur, that patient believes that you made an error in your practice and that you tried to cover it up and not manage it. And so it becomes a much more challenging situation where when the college looks at it, they say, why didn't you provide that full disclosure? Because then this whole situation could have been mitigated. And so by not disclosing up front, the situation kind of blew out of proportion to what it might have been otherwise. And so I think having fulsome disclosure is also a major component of communication. The last thing is not a fulsome example, but one that I think is interesting to raise because it does come up. So I've had a couple of dental clients who use a hearing aid. And so when they communicate, they might be speaking louder than the average person because of how they hear their own voice through the hearing aid. But a patient might interpret that communication as being aggressive, as being like they're being yelled at. And so I've had several clients have complaints to the college where a patient said they were aggressive, they were yelling at me, it was an awful experience, when really the dentist is a perfectly nice individual, did not think they were yelling, but just had that, they were speaking more loudly to accommodate for their hearing aid. And so in those kind of circumstances, that could be completely avoided if the dentist had an early upfront conversation with the patient and felt comfortable disclosing, hey, look, just so you know, I might speak a little bit more loudly than an average person. This is why, and I don't want you to take it in any wrong way, especially if you're getting into a tricky communication situation where tensions are high. It's worth taking a pause and making sure that that's clear, because the way you communicate might be interpreted differently by them. So those are a few examples that I've seen, but there are countless that come up throughout a dental practice.
John, thanks. You've really set us up, frankly, for the next question, which is, we really hope that one size fits all, but we know it doesn't. There isn't a uniform way of speaking with patients, particularly dentists that have such diverse practices. So I think I'll ask Ahmad this first. Can you offer some suggestions for how dentists can engage then in respectful dialogue during those challenging patient conversations that John just alluded to?
For sure. So I always start with this, for starters, always remain calm and try not to let the emotions of the moment sort of get the better of you. Often these challenging conversations include, criticisms of the dentist or treatment they provided. And this can understandably make a dentist feel defensive, or feel like their work is being scrutinized. But it's important to always remain calm and be professional. And remember that you are the regulated professional, not the patient. So you do have these obligations that are frankly not incumbent on patients. It's also perhaps a good idea to address these sorts of issues through a discussion rather than, say, over email or in writing. Sometimes written communications don't land as effectively as speaking to someone directly, and it can actually lead to an escalation of the situation. It's always, or at least I find, really difficult sometimes to strike a balance and an appropriate tone when you're writing. And you're there sort of in, rather than being there in real time to clarify any misunderstandings. someone might be left, for instance, if you send, an email response or a letter back, the patient may be left to sort of fester with a point that you never really intended to make. So perhaps ask, a patient if they can meet to discuss the issue, or to speak over the phone, and that might be sort of an effective way of broaching the conversation with them. But another thing I'd recommend is to ensure that you're actively listening to the patient. And John alluded to this a little earlier. Firstly, sometimes people just want to be heard. There may be things going on with them that are posing challenges. It could be a prior negative experience with a healthcare provider, or they may be experiencing something totally unrelated to you. Now, of course, that's not your fault, but you're in a line of work where you deal with real people and you're interacting with people on a daily basis. So these issues can arise. It's important as part of active listening to do just that, to listen and let someone express themselves and receive that information in a calm way. Avoid interrupting the patient when they're articulating, the concern, because again, that may lead to an escalation of the situation and make them feel like they're being cut off. And it's important, I think, when approaching these interactions, to sort of remember that there isn't this inherent power imbalance between the dentist and the patient. So something like an interruption, for instance, may, as I've said, sort of raise the temperature or make a patient feel like their concerns aren't being received. Second, and sort of as part of this active listening exercise, it's helpful to repeat back to the patient, what their concerns are and what they've said. Now, as I've said, it's part of active listening, and it can serve a couple of purposes. So firstly, by repeating a concern back to a patient, you're ensuring that you understand what their concern is. It may be that the patient has raised sort of a number of different issues, but when you repeat them back to them, they can actually sort of receive that information and then maybe parse through those issues and clarify what their real concern is. So for instance, Mr. So-and-so, you raised several issues with me just now. I understand that you're concerned about sort of X, Y, and Z. And in hearing that, a patient may sort of think, well, actually, you know what? This is my real concern. It was the issue with the tone, or was the issue with the file that broke off, or whatever the issue may be. This confirms to the patient that you've also listened to their concern, and that you understand what they're trying to express. That's sort of the second part of sort of repeating something back to them. The second benefit of that is that it helps sort of validate their feelings. That's not to say you have to agree with them at all, but it shows that you've been receptive to the concerns and that you've listened to the patient. And if you've misunderstood a concern, again, it gives them that opportunity to clarify it for you. And it is an effective way of sort of ratcheting the temperature down a bit. You can then have a discussion about the issue and try to reach common ground or try and resolve it. So first I'd say, listen, then, summarize back to the patient, check you understand the concerns, and if there are issues, correct that understanding. So that's really sort of, those are the key kind of components of active listening. I'd also recommend, and you're going to hear this sort of throughout the evening, that you document everything in the patient's record as soon as you can. This can ensure that there's a contemporaneous record of the communication, which may end up assisting down the road if there's, for instance, a complaint made. It may be also helpful to follow up the discussion that you have with the patient. So I initially said better to have a discussion, or maybe helpful to have a discussion sort of verbally. But it may also be helpful to follow that discussion up with a letter which summarizes what you've spoken about. And of course, you can pop that letter into the record as well, and then that forms part of that documentation. The college's website also has some helpful guidance with respect to navigating, these kinds of challenging patient conversations. And the other thing is, it may help, depending on the situation and depending on sort of the nature of the issue, it may help to have someone else in the room with you. That could be, one of your colleagues or an assistant, or just someone there who can, assist you if there is a challenging conversation, but can also be there in case things do escalate. And often when there's that third person in the room, it may not feel as personal, and it may sort of facilitate a discussion of the issue. So those are sort of some of the points that I would highlight in terms of navigating these challenging conversations, which will arise in your practice.
Thanks. John, I think if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to hear a few of those tips that you may have as well about engaging in those respectful conversations when things are a little challenging.
Yeah, I always frame it, and the same for me as a lawyer, but be the reasonable voice in the room. And I know that that can be a really hard thing to do when somebody is questioning your professionalism or questioning your clinical care. It can be very hard not to get defensive. But I think one way of thinking about it that I explained once to a client was because they said, well, the patient was yelling at me, so I yelled back at the patient. And I said, well, the college doesn't regulate a patient's behavior. They regulate your behavior. And so you matching what they're doing will certainly be considered in the context of a complaint, but that doesn't mean that what you did was professional. And there might have been better ways for you to address it. So I think it's really important to always consider trying to be the kind of cool, calm, collected voice in the room. I think that will always serve you well if you're in any of these situations. Another thing that's actually gaining popularity, and I think it's a really important thing that dentists and all healthcare providers should really look into, is the idea of becoming a trauma-informed, get trauma-informed training. This is something that helps you recognize where other people might be coming from in their life, what might be kind of causing things in a way that allows you to approach them with more empathy, with more compassion, rather than getting your back up depending on how the conversation is going. And I think especially in the relationship between a healthcare provider and a patient, where there is that kind of power dynamic and vulnerability of the patient, is especially that much more important for you to be aware of the potential impact that the way you are coming across to them, even if you're matching the way that they're coming across to you. So I think that's something that I recommend to a lot of my clients. I can't highlight enough to what Ahmad was saying about documenting and having someone else in the room. When I speak from the perspective of a defense lawyer representing dentists when these complaints come into the college, the best evidence that I can put forward in these situations is the contemporaneous notes taken at that time that describe kind of exactly what happened, because that's often going to be more reliable than the patient's memory several months later, as well as having someone else in the room with you where they can then put together a witness statement, and then it's not just a he said, she said situation, but now there's something that the college can look at that corroborates what you're saying on how the conversation went, assuming that's the case. And it's really helpful then in having the college kind of review the matter. And so I think that if you have a particularly challenging patient, make sure that your assistant knows to kind of stay in the room, not just during the treatment, but for the entire time that the patient is in the room. If you have something that's kind of getting a little bit trickier, make sure your staff know to stick around or to come in if there's nobody in there at the time, just so you have someone else around. Now, the last thing I'd say that's worth considering in these situations, because sometimes they can escalate and get worse, is if you feel like the dentist-patient trusting relationship has been ruptured in a way that you don't feel you can come back from, or there's any way to repair it, you should consider whether at that stage it makes sense to terminate the dentist-patient relationship and appropriately refer. And now there's very specific ways to do that. I've had many dentists come to me and say, I just told them never to come back. That's not the way that you should be doing it. The college has guidance and a kind of template letter online. You can get legal advice on it, but it's important that you don't abandon your patient when you're doing that. But it's very important to consider, okay, has this dentist-patient relationship now gotten to the point where there's no trust in my ability to provide them care such that I shouldn't be doing it anymore? And that's an important thing to consider when things really escalate to this level, and something that a lawyer or an association can kind of help you navigate if you run into that.
Thanks, John. I think probably in the interest of time, it would be really helpful for us to move on to informed consent. And so we've been talking a lot about those challenging situations. So we're going to keep on with that theme. But I'm wondering what tips you could provide dentists about how to show that they took reasonable steps to get valid informed consent, even when there's a complex or a challenging situation. So John, if I can ask you first, and then we'll go over to Ahmad.
Yeah, and I just spoke about contemporaneous notes, but that
Yeah.
is your best friend when it comes to informed consent. And when I say contemporaneous notes, I know many people kind of work off of general templates and copy and paste where it says informed consent received. that's not your best evidence of having had a thorough informed consent discussion, because to the college, when they're reviewing that, that just looks like you copied and pasted a general note, and it doesn't actually mean that you had the conversation in that specific instance or not. So I think an important thing is always try to include specifics about that particular discussion with that particular patient that truly shows you did have that discussion with that patient. Is it writing down some of the questions that the patient asked and the answers that you gave? Is it unique considerations to the treatment that that patient might be getting? But I would say your best method of showing that you obtained informed consent is having that documented note. Now, the second thing, which is kind of a double-edged sword, I would say, is a signed consent form. So some dentists and other healthcare practitioners and other disciplines think that if you have a signed consent form, well, it totally means that they gave informed consent and there's no way of challenging that. But a signed consent form doesn't necessarily mean that, because, I mean, I'm a lawyer and I don't read consent forms most of the time that I go and sign them. So it doesn't mean that I've actually given informed consent. What an informed consent form can be good for is helping to educate the patient, making sure that you identify everything that you have talked to them about, and them acknowledging that they have had that conversation. But if it's a pro forma, here's a form, you're probably not going to read it and sign off on it, that isn't evidence of informed consent. And just having a signed form like that isn't going to protect you if there's a complaint that you didn't properly get informed consent. So if used properly, it can be a really strong tool in confirming that you got that informed consent, but it on its own is not enough. And so I would definitely caution dentists who rely on that as being kind of the final word on informed consent. Now, in terms of some tips, Ahmad already raised the idea of having a patient repeat back some of it. I think that's the best way of finding out if a patient is misunderstanding what you're saying, because if they can't repeat it back or they say something wrong, that's a perfect opportunity to clarify and make sure you're on the same page. I would also say that many of the treatments that you'll provide won't just be at one appointment and will be over many appointments. And a lot of dentists think that, oh, if I just raise it at the one appointment, it's totally fine. It is important that you kind of re-raise that as you go along, because some of the considerations may have changed, their understanding may have changed. It's important that you kind of see informed consent as a kind of living document, not quite document, but kind of a living thing where you're talking about it at different points, and it's not just a one and done conversation to have. Now, a couple of little points I really wanted to raise that I see come up is a caution when informed consent is being obtained partway through a procedure. So sometimes you are partway through a procedure and you realize that, you know what, I really think we should do this or do that other thing. And sometimes that's an urgent thing, and you do have to have that conversation on the spot and they need to make a decision on the spot. But I've had several complaints where it really wasn't urgent and the patient felt pressured and they felt they didn't have the time to really think because they had dental tools in their mouth and weren't quite sure what was going on and were very stressed out by the situation. So think about that. If you don't have to continue with the treatment right away and there's any hesitancy on their part, think about perhaps waiting till another appointment or figuring out another option or stopping and having the discussion where they're not laying down in the dental chair so that you can actually have a calmer consent discussion. I also want to highlight that informed consent does include discussion around fees. And so many of you think it's really only about the clinical care, but the college does see fees as a required element of informed consent. And so that doesn't mean you need to know the exact fee going in. Sometimes it's unclear until you finish, but a patient shouldn't be surprised by a fee at the end of a treatment, and that should be a part of your discussion throughout.
Those are very helpful tips, John. Thank you. I'll note for everybody on the line that in the chat, we've been putting all kinds of resources. So I draw the attention of everybody there. So you can go onto our website and you can use the links that have been put into the chat. Ahmad, can I turn that over to you then for your tips about dealing with informed consent, please?
Absolutely. So John has provided some really helpful practical tips. I'll focus my comments, I think, a little bit more on sort of the publications and the standard of practice that you have at the college. So there is a new standard on consent to treatment, which was approved by council in March of this year. It is on the website. And it sets out the requirements for obtaining consent to treatment. I highly recommend that you review this and you familiarize yourself with the requirements. But as the standard says, by obtaining the patient's full and informed consent, you're also helping to enhance communication with patients, which is why we've included this in this discussion. It helps build trust and to manage risks arising from treatment. But as you know, and as John's mentioned, treatment can't be provided without first obtaining, valid consent. And the duty to ensure that consent is obtained does rest, of course, with the dentist. You have the duty to provide an accurate explanation of the treatment options, the risks, and as John said, the costs. And I'm going to keep saying this, but as John mentioned, it's not just a piece of paper. It's a process. It's ongoing. It's a discussion that you have with the patients. It's not just something that they sign, and it's not just something that you tick off. And it begins before treatment's provided. And as we've discussed, it can be renewed throughout the course of treatment. So it's not just one thing that you get right at the beginning, and that's it. I've ticked the box. And again, these are issues that come up quite commonly in your practice or in the practice. Now, if there are any concerns about whether consent is valid, or if you're unsure, if there's concerns that someone may not have understood, don't provide the treatment and have that further discussion to satisfy those concerns. I'll speak a little bit in terms of the process. The standard also provides some helpful points in that regard. So consent has to be related to a specific treatment that's being proposed. So as we've said, a general consent won't cut it. It's got to be for a specific treatment. It also has to be informed and voluntary. And as part of being informed, you have to make sure that the patient is given, the information that we've been discussing, including sort of the nature of the treatment, the benefits, the risks, any side effects, information about alternative courses of action, and any consequences of not receiving that treatment. And as we've been saying, you really have to ensure that the patient understands what the information they're being provided is. You have to, and it's your responsibility to ensure that you're available to answer questions, and that you're available for a discussion with the patient. It's not, you don't dictate treatment to them. It's something that, they have to consent to. And as part of that, it is a discussion, and you should be prepared to answer questions, should encourage patients to answer questions if you have any. And of course, document these things, because that will really help you as we've been alluding to. Sometimes it may be that there are some language issues with a particular patient. If there is a language barrier, it may be helpful to have sort of someone to translate for you, or you may want to sort of utilize some other resources to be able to ensure that your patient fully understands what it is that you're proposing. Now we've hit on fees. Fees are also referred to in the standard, and they are relevant to obtaining consent. Dentists have to ensure that the information about these fees is disclosed to patients before treatment, and also any relevant insurance information. So that's part of it. It's not just the cost, but also there may be some issues with insurance that you need to convey to patients. Now, as John said, you don't need to predict it down to the penny, although I'm not even sure if we use pennies anymore. But you don't have to give it an exact amount, but they should generally know what they are getting into and what the fee will be, as best you can predict it. And of course, as we've said, all of this should be documented in the patient's record. And particularly the more complex and risky the treatment, the more specific and detailed the documentation should be. And it's important to use your judgment on this one. If there is a particularly complex set of circumstances or treatment's risky, really ensure that you're documenting your consent discussions. And again, it is a discussion. It's not just, I've gotten the signed consent and off we go. Now, in addition to the standard, which I've sort of discussed in my response, there's also other helpful resources on the website. There's a checklist that you can review, and there's an FAQ as well. And you also have the option of contacting the college's practice advisory service if there is a particularly challenging case. or to obtain, legal advice if it gets to that. But I think, the important point to convey there is you have resources available to you. Sometimes these can be tricky, and avail yourself of these resources that you have. And the last thing I sort of wanted to hit on is sometimes in explaining treatment, and I've had this in my own experience, visual aids can be helpful. It may be that explaining exactly what's going to happen, using a visual aid to a patient can be helpful and can clarify any concerns. John was just talking about back pain. I've struggled with my own. I had no idea, what it was, but then when it was explained to me using a visual aid, I could absolutely understand what it was. So sometimes those can be helpful tools as well.
Thanks, Ahmad. I'm going to ask if you could be in the hot seat again for just a little bit longer. I want to switch gears because at the beginning of our conversation, we were talking a bit about how we were going to bring up professional boundaries. And so I'd like to put to you the question, what are some red flags that are signs of crossing professional boundaries, even when the intent may not have been inappropriate?
Sure. So, I mean, as you mentioned, when we started out, we were talking about communication challenges that can lead to boundaries issues. I've already sort of hit on the example of jokes. This is an issue that comes up quite a lot. When a dentist makes a comment that's not related to treatment, it can be a joke or it can be a political comment, and it's not well received by a patient. You really don't want to be getting into a political or social debate with a patient. That's not why they're there. They're there to receive treatment. So, getting into these kinds of issues, although they're important in our world, it's not the forum to do that, and that can lead to a boundary issue. So I try and steer clear from anything contentious or controversial. And sometimes you may be on the receiving end of these comments, right? It's not just it may be that a patient makes an inappropriate comment, or that a patient raises an issue that you disagree with. Just remember to be calm and to bear in mind that you do have obligations, and again, you're the regulated professional. Another common issue that arises is sharing personal information or details with a patient. Sometimes it can just be as simple as talking about personal challenges or anything like that. But there are also examples of dentists sharing perhaps a personal cell phone number with a patient. Now, the intention there may just be to be accessible. It may not be something that is sort of nefarious at all. It's just, hey, I want to be accessible to my patients. You may be in a smaller community. But before you know it, then a patient may start reaching out to you by text. And those communications can be fraught with risk. I've always found that there is an inherent breakdown in professionalism when folks start to exchange texts with one another. And there's a risk that things can start to become too familiar with the patient, which can then, of course, lead to these boundary concerns that we're talking about, even when the dentist may have only been trying, as I said, to be accessible to their patients. You can be accessible without providing personal details. It might be helpful, for instance, to use, say, an office email account that's linked to your phone so that you can respond quickly. But there is that sort of barrier, and there is a more formal channel. And there's also a better record kept of email versus sort of text messages. The communications go right into the patient's file, rather than having all these communications on a personal cell phone that, frankly, probably won't make it into the patient's file, right? Once you get to down the line, and if there's any sort of issue that's raised to the college, it is a red flag to have extensive communications with a patient on a personal cell phone, or being overly familiar with them. Another challenge that we've hit on tonight is social media. I mean, it's the 21st century, and we're all on social media in one way or another. Patients may add you to social media. It can be a TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. I've had clients add me to social media as well. But I would proceed with caution here too. LinkedIn might be somewhat of a different kettle of fish just because of the professional focus, but even LinkedIn could pose challenges. And the concern, of course, is that someone adds you, they may see what you post, and that can expose you to some risk in terms of them knowing more about you. But then there's this challenge or this risk of things becoming overly familiar. A patient may even develop an interest in your personal life. I mean, it happens. It's not, it's not always sort of in one direction. It could always be in the other as well. A patient may reach out, and then again, before you know it, the tone of the communications has changed, and the relationship is more from sort of a professional one to one with a personal side to it. And again, it doesn't matter if it's the patient that's reached out to you. And I think that's an important thing, going back to sort of assumptions. You are the regulated professional. It's always going to be your responsibility to maintain professional boundaries. There is no responsibility on the patient to do that. So generally speaking, I'd be very careful with social media communications. As I mentioned, I've had clients add me on social media. And while it's awkward, I usually just leave those invites outstanding. And you do have guidance in your practice advisory on social media, and you have a lot of good resources available to you. And sometimes, it may be worth just having a discussion with a patient and saying, look, I've seen you've added me here or there. That's just not something I can do. It may be awkward for a moment, but again, it's a better approach to not engage in those kinds of communications. Another red flag, and I'll sort of wrap up my answer with this one, is, as I said, sort of sharing personal details of lives with patients. You have to be careful about those. They may lead to boundary issues. Patients may also just feel uncomfortable knowing about aspects of their dentist's personal lives. They may be very private people, and they may not sort of want, they may not be there to hear about those things. And it's a common example is, you're riding in an Uber, you don't necessarily want to sort of speak to your Uber driver the whole time. And so it's sort of a similar thing with these issues of sharing personal information. So again, review the guidelines on maintaining boundaries. Those will provide some helpful information about how to navigate certain things. But those are some of the red flags that we see when it comes to boundaries.
Thanks very much, Ahmad. John, I think in the interest of time, we've got like 1 minute, or you can add 1 point to this. I know you wanted to say something about it, so I'll turn the floor over to you, and then we'll bring around the last question.
Yeah, there's only one thing that I do want to address, and that's going just one step further and to talk about sexual communication with the patient, because a lot of dentists and healthcare providers don't realize actually how serious that is. So the legislation that governs the 26 health colleges, including the RCDSO, has a very broad definition of sexual abuse. And that actually includes not just sexual touching and sexual actions, but behavior or remarks of a sexual nature. And so if the college finds that you made behavior or remarks of a sexual nature towards a patient, which is somebody who is either now a patient or has been in the prior year, they actually have an obligation to revoke your license. They don't have any discretion to kind of think about it differently. If it meets that sexual abuse term, then you are in a very serious situation. And so that's where, when Ahmad talks about those professional boundaries, you want to be very careful about ever coming close to that line, because it can be very detrimental to your career.
Thanks, John. I know that was a heavy point to be landing on at the end. So I'll ask if you could each, just in 1 minute, give us a takeaway. What's one thing you would like the viewers to take away from the discussion today? So Ahmad, I'd like to turn it over to you and then back over to John.
Yeah, I mean, really, these are very challenging issues. They are difficult to deal with. You're dealing with real people, which is one of the benefits of your line of work, that you get to interact with real people in the real world, but it's also a challenge. So I'd say, use your judgment and ask for help where needed. You're fortunate enough to have lots of resources available to you out there to assist you to navigate these challenges, and you're not alone. So if you're facing a challenging set of circumstances, it may be helpful to reach out, and you do have resources available to you through the college as well.
Thank you. John?
So I think the most important thing to reiterate in all of this is that documentation is key. So many dentists think that it's only important to document the clinical care that's provided, but the communications are so important as well. When I represent dentists on these kind of files, it's always easier and it reduces your stress going through one of these complaints if you have a really clear note or if you had somebody else in the room, because it makes it much easier to respond to. And so between that and my advice to always be that reasonable person in the room, the way I look at it myself as a lawyer, because I also have similar obligations to be the reasonable person in the room, is I'm like, okay, if I saw this on the front of a newspaper, if this appeared in front of a judge in court, would I be embarrassed? And so that's something to always think about, because nowadays in the digital world we live in, sometimes you have patients that are recording you without knowing. Sometimes this will pop up word for word in front of the college or someone else. And so just really think about how you want yourself to be perceived if that ever did come forward. And as Ahmad said, not only is the college a resource, but there's other resources like the Canadian Dental Protective Association, like lawyers, where you can get access to advice to support you through challenging situations before they've gotten too far. So always think, if you're unsure in a situation, maybe try to get some early advice so that it doesn't keep going down a difficult path. But otherwise, thank you so much for having us here tonight.
I appreciate it. So I think I'd like to just take one more moment because we've got an interesting question here, given all of the social media commentary that the two of you just made. And one of the questions is, could you provide some guidelines on how to respond to a negative Google review or a Yelp review, especially if the patient is including some inaccurate information in their review? And John, if I'm wondering if you could take that sort of for about 20, 30 seconds to give us a quick snapshot of how you would address that.
Yeah, it's really case by case, but the unfortunate reality is I would normally say it's better to not respond than respond at all, because if you respond, first off, you might be disclosing personal health information without their consent, which might result in some issues there. And sometimes I've found dentists respond in a way that then results in the college looking at them for professionalism concerns. So I think the reality is any kind of business, restaurant, a dental clinic, a law firm will have some negative reviews out there. And sometimes it's better to not engage because it's more likely to escalate. Now, there are definitely situations where that wouldn't be the advice I would give, but not as common. And so it's worth seeking advice if you're really concerned.
Thank you. Ahmad, do you want to say just 2 seconds worth of commentary on that one as well?
I mean, I think I totally agree with John. I think sometimes the end result is not going to be what you want it to be anyway. You're not going to necessarily get someone to take down their review, and people can just continue to post anyway. So I would try and ignore it. And if it is a significant concern, then as John said, maybe seek out some advice and see what you can do about it. But very often, it may just be prompting another response from the person who posted it.
Thank you both for your time. I'd just like to say how grateful I am that you were with us tonight to share your insights and to give us some really helpful tips about effective communication. To the participants, I hope you found this a useful session for your practices. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Harinder, please.
Thank you, Ahmad, Jill, and John, for an absolutely great discussion. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to share important information with the profession. To everyone who joined this evening, this session has been approved for 1 point in Category 1. Participants are required to attend for at least 40 minutes to be eligible for the point. You don't need to do anything to receive your certificate. We will draw on the records from Zoom and send certificates out within 5 business days. As always, if you have any practice-related questions, please reach out to the staff in the college's Practice Advisory Service. You can also follow the college's social media accounts to receive our latest news, updates, and resources. We hope you can join us at future RCDSO Connect sessions. We plan to hold many more virtual sessions in 2025. Thank you again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of the evening.